Get down! The warning came an instant before the steel support beam ripped free from its corroded housing and slammed into the deck with a gut-wrenching clang. Sparks scattered like fireflies across the dimly lit hangar. The Oblivion groaned, the old war transport barely holding together under its own neglected weight. Commander Varric Isard shoved a junior technician out of the way, boots scraping against rust-streaked flooring as another chunk of the overhead framework buckled. "This ship isn't battle-ready," Isard muttered, voice tight. "It isn't even salvageable." Chief Engineer Reg Tannhorst wiped sweat from his brow, leaving behind a smear of grease. He kicked at a loose panel on the deck. "It's worse than that. This thing's a funeral pyre waiting to happen. Dominion sent us a damn tomb and called it a gift." The gift stood before them in all its derelict shame. A carcass of a vessel, warped plating stitched together with scavenged alloys, exposed conduits hissing with vented gas. The once magnificent ship had been reduced to a graveyard of Dominion technology. It was meant to be a symbol of Earth's dependency, a leash disguised as a token of goodwill. The Dominion officials watched from the command deck above, their elongated forms half hidden in the hazy blue glow of atmospheric shielding. Envoy Zell Luthak stood at the forefront, his expression betraying the amusement he didn't bother concealing. "Commander Isard," he called down, his words carrying the slow drawl of condescension, "your silence concerns me. The Galactic Dominion does not often extend such generosity. I trust the Oblivion meets your expectations." Isard rolled his shoulders back, expression locked in place. He could feel his crew's eyes on him, waiting, watching. He knew what this moment was. A test. A spectacle. The Dominion wanted humanity to thank them for this husk, to bow their heads and accept their place. "It exceeds them, Envoy," Isard said coolly. "I didn't think your people would ever allow us access to a warship, even one as—" He let his gaze sweep across the rusted vessel, deliberate, calculating, historic as this. Luthak's thin lips curled. "Then we will leave you to it. May your people learn much from this experience." With that, the Dominion delegation turned and exited, their robes swishing, their intent clear. They wouldn't waste time monitoring a doomed project. That was their mistake. The second the Dominion's transport disappeared beyond the bay doors, the tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. "Captain," Dr. Harlan Voss said, stepping forward, his usually mild voice carrying an edge. "Before you get too comfortable, you need to see this." Voss was a man of few words. He never spoke without reason. That alone set Isard on alert. "Show me." Voss handed him the diagnostic pad, his fingers tightening around the device like he didn't want to let go. Isard barely had to read past the first few lines before the weight of what he was seeing hit him like a kinetic slug to the chest. The Oblivion wasn't just in disrepair, it had been deliberately compromised. Weapons targeting relays weren't just stripped, they were rewired to malfunction under high energy output. Primary thrusters had hidden governor codes embedded so that even under manual control, they would never reach combat speed. And the reactor, it was the worst of it. The power core, which should have been an obsolete fusion drive, was instead something far more dangerous. It had Dominion origin energy cycling deliberately throttled down to 5% functionality. They hadn't just been handed a broken ship. They'd been given a war machine with its throat slit, its fangs pulled, and its spine shattered. Isard let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening around the datapad. "How long until we're operational?" Tannhorst let out a dry laugh, a bitter edge beneath it. "Define operational. If you mean drifting corpse with a functioning toaster, we're already there. If you mean combat-ready death trap, you're asking for a miracle." Isard looked back at the ship. "Then I'd suggest we start making miracles." Tannhorst frowned. "This thing wasn't meant to fly again, Varric. Then we make it fly. And we make damn sure that when it does, the Dominion regrets ever handing it to us." A silence stretched between them, weighted, electric. Then finally Tannhorst exhaled sharply and rubbed at his jaw. "Fine, but don't expect clean work. This is going to be held together with spit and sheer force of will. Isard nodded once, already turning back to his officers. Then let's start with the reactor. Get me a full layout of every buried function they tried to shut down. If this thing has claws, I want them sharpened. Voss was already moving, fingers flying over his display. I'll need time, and people who know how to work with Dominion energy systems. Take what you need. Work in teams. If the Dominion left any traps behind, I want multiple pairs of eyes spotting them before they tear this ship apart. Tannhorst crossed his arms. And what about their next move? You really think they'll let us keep this ship once they realize we're fixing what they broke? They won't realize. Isard turned his head, meeting his engineer's skeptical gaze. Because as far as they're concerned, we're failing. Voss caught on first. You want to make it look worse? Isard nodded. Keep external repairs minimal. Make it look like we're struggling. They think humans lack the ability to work with their systems? Let's encourage that belief. The longer they underestimate us, the longer we have to prepare. A slow grin tugged at Tannhorst's face. This is going to be the ugliest refit in history. Then let's get started. The next hours were a blur of frantic movement. Engineers gutted the ship's inner corridors, working under dim emergency lights, hands coated in coolant residue. Sparks rained down as panels were pried open, revealing Dominion hardware that pulsed with hidden potential. Tannhorst led the overhaul of the power core, peeling back the restrictive failsafes, layer by layer. The deeper they went, the more sinister the sabotage became. This wasn't incompetence. This was deliberate suppression. Voss found the worst of it, buried in the ship's central AI, a line of code that, had they activated too many systems at once, would have sent a full distress beacon straight to Dominion forces. They would have been executed before they ever left the hangar. Isard's jaw clenched as he stared at the looping script. Then, with a flick of his fingers, he deleted it. You tried to kill us before we even got started, he muttered. Your mistake. The oblivion rumbled beneath his feet, as if waking from a long slumber, and for the first time in decades, its core systems began to come alive. The oblivion shuddered like a creature roused from deep slumber. Its internal systems, stripped of their Dominion-imposed shackles, flickered to life one by one. Emergency lights sputtered and blinked out as the power grid rerouted energy, reclaiming circuits that had been locked down for decades. A low vibration coursed through the floor. A heartbeat reawakened. Commander Varric Isard exhaled slowly, fingers tightening around the edge of a laser plasma display. That's it. She's waking up. Chief Engineer Reg Tannhorst ran a calloused hand across the exposed paneling near the reactor control station, feeling the static crackle under his fingertips. Not quite yet. Right now, she's just remembering what it's like to breathe. Dr. Harlan Voss leaned in, his usual detached demeanor edged with something close to reverence. Give it time. This thing's been buried alive for years. We just cracked the coffin open. His gaze flicked across the display, scanning over streams of Dominion script that scrolled in jagged bursts. She's trying to resist us. We still haven't bypassed all the internal security barriers. Isard's eyes narrowed. Then let's finish cutting those chains. The command deck was a nest of barely contained chaos. Engineers moved in coordinated bursts, tools clattering against consoles, voices murmuring updates in clipped, urgent tones. The Dominion's original interface had been purged, its smug superiority replaced with something raw and efficient. Human engineering, stripped of unnecessary complexity. But oblivion fought them. As Tannhorst routed new power conduits, a warning signal blared across the heads-up displays. The reactor surged unexpectedly, sending a pulse through the system that forced the lights to flicker again. A momentary blackout swallowed the deck before auxiliary systems stabilized. Voss! Isard snapped. Voss's fingers danced over the console, translating alien script faster than any automated decryption program could. His jaw clenched as he isolated the source of the interference. She's rejecting the Dominion controls violently. The power fluctuations aren't random. She's self-correcting to default settings, but those settings were sabotaged. If we don't stabilize her, we'll be looking at a full system collapse. Tannhorst swore under his breath. The Dominion didn't just disable her, they broke her mind. We're trying to get a crippled predator back on its feet, and she doesn't remember how to hunt." Isard stepped forward, gaze fixed on the erratic energy readings. This wasn't just an old ship struggling to function. This was a machine that had been wounded on purpose, its core programming fractured, unable to reconcile the brutal war machine it had been with the hollowed-out wreck it had become. "Let's remind her," he said. Tannhorst exchanged a glance with Voss before nodding. "Reactor override? Do it." The moment the command was executed, the Oblivion screamed, not in sound but in movement. A sudden violent jolt as power slammed through neglected systems, forcing them awake. The ship trembled, the structural supports groaning as long-dormant servos and kinetic dampeners re-engaged. Displays surged with new data, entire sections of the ship unlocking themselves as Dominion restrictions crumbled. Then, silence. Tannhorst exhaled through his nose. "She's still alive." Isard's gaze flicked to the laser plasma display where one particular system had come online. Not a primary function, not life support, weapons. The Oblivion's original combat framework had been buried beneath Dominion interference. Now the ship's teeth were showing again. Voss adjusted the display, frowning. "It's partial. We have targeting matrices but no control interfaces. The hardware is intact, but the fire control system was stripped and gutted." "They didn't trust us with guns," Isard muttered. "Cowards." Tannhorst scoffed. "They trust their own arrogance more than they fear us. That's their mistake." He studied the data, tapping his fingers against the console. "We can fix this." The Dominion relied on automated targeting solutions, which means they made everything too dependent on networked AI. They sacrificed adaptability for control. Isard's lips curled. "Which means we can do better." Tannhorst grinned. "Damn right we can. If we gut their auto-locking software and replace it with old-school manual overrides, we can regain full control." Voss raised an eyebrow. "Manual fire control on a ship this size? That's archaic." "Archaic is better than dead," Isard said. "And if they think we're still trying to learn their systems, they won't expect us to operate like humans instead of Dominion drones." Tannhorst cracked his knuckles. "Then we get to work." Hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Engineering teams stripped down Dominion circuitry, replacing it with direct control input stations that bypass the automated targeting protocols. Each modification felt like peeling away a layer of Dominion arrogance, revealing the raw, vicious potential that had been locked away. Isard monitored every adjustment, every recalibration. This wasn't just about making the ship combat-ready. This was about making it human-ready, rebuilding it in a way that suited their kind, not the Dominion's sterile efficiency. Then, as Voss finalized the last override, a new anomaly appeared on the display. His hand stilled. "What is that?" Tannhorst leaned in, his usual snark absent as his gaze fixed on the incoming data. "That's not supposed to be there." The anomaly wasn't part of the Dominion's original sabotage. It wasn't a lockout, a failsafe, or a firewall. It was a buried signature, a pulse of data cycling on an ancient subfrequency deep within the ship's core. Isard's blood ran cold. "Voss," he said, voice even, "decrypt it." Voss's fingers flew across the keys. The room fell into a tense hush as the signal was processed. It wasn't Dominion script. It was something older, more raw. The encryption wasn't designed to keep humans out. It was designed to keep something else from getting in. A sequence of fragmented text scrolled across the screen. Then, in unmistakably human script, a name appeared. Tannhorst leaned in, reading it aloud. "Project Revenant." Silence. Isard stared at the words, unease curling in his gut. "That's not Dominion. That's ours." Voss's fingers twitched. "We weren't supposed to find this." A flicker of movement flashed across the display. Something inside the ship had just activated. And Oblivion, no, Revenant, shuddered once more. Not with resistance, with recognition. The Oblivion, no, Revenant, responded like a beast shaking off the last of its chains. The ship's systems pulsed with something Isard couldn't quite put into words. Not just restored power, not just reactivated combat functions. It recognized itself. Dr. Voss's hands hovered over the display, his breath barely audible. "This wasn't meant for us," he muttered. "This was buried on purpose. Someone, somewhere, didn't want this ship to be found." The command deck carried an unnatural stillness, the crew's collective unease thick in the air. Even the usual sounds of engineering work, clanking tools, grinding servos, seemed distant, swallowed by something heavier than silence. Isard finally spoke. "Then let's make sure they regret losing it." The words broke whatever spell held them. Tannhorst flexed his fingers, his voice snapping back to its usual grit. "We've got a problem, though. If Project Revenant was human-made, why the hell did the Dominion have it? And why give it back to us, crippled but still breathing? Maybe they thought we'd never wake it up," Isard said, scanning the updated display. New data trickled in, weapon systems realigning, long-dormant subsystems booting without manual input. "Maybe they didn't think we could." Voss's jaw tensed as he analyzed the decrypted logs. "Or maybe they wanted us to find it after they had us where they wanted us." A proximity alert blared across the command deck. Tannhorst's head snapped toward the primary heads-up display. "That's a Dominion vessel inbound," Lieutenant Duval confirmed, already adjusting the external sensor feeds. "Fast approach vector. Scans show they're—" His voice faltered, and that was what made Isard move. "What?" Duval swallowed, fingers tightening around the console. "They're locking us in." Isard strode forward, the deck vibrating beneath his boots as he loomed over the display. "Explain." Duval exhaled sharply. "They're not slowing down. No hails, no standard approach pattern. Just a direct line, and they're broadcasting Dominion override codes." Voss went rigid. "They're trying to trigger the failsafe, the self-destruct." "Too late for that," Tannhorst growled. "We already cut that leash." "Then what the hell are they doing?" Isard demanded. As if in response, a new data stream forced its way onto their screens. Text in Dominion script flooded the main display, interlaced with flickering human code that didn't belong. It was an order. "Surrender control. You were never meant to reactivate Project Revenant." For a beat, no one moved. Then Isard clenched his jaw. "They knew," he murmured. "They were waiting." Voss's hands flew across his console. "They're trying to brute force the locks back into place. If we don't cut them off now, do it." Voss didn't hesitate. His fingers stabbed at the controls, isolating and severing Dominion access pathways before they could latch onto anything critical. The moment their connection was cut, the Dominion ship reacted. "They're accelerating!" Duval shouted. "Weapons hot!" The attack came without hesitation. A spear of energy split through the black, aimed directly for Revenant's unshielded flank. But the ship moved, not by command, not by reaction, by instinct. The deck lurched as the inertial dampeners barely caught up with the sudden burst of power. Isard braced against the nearest bulkhead, eyes flicking to the control panel. "Tannhorst!" "Not me!" Tannhorst barked, hands up. "I didn't touch anything!" Voss stared at the display, pulse hammering against his ribs. "She moved on her own." The word sent a chill through the command deck, but there was no time to process it. "They're adjusting!" Duval snapped. "Second strike incoming!" "Then we hit back!" Isard roared. "Fire control! What do we have?" Tannhorst was already pulling up targeting solutions. "Weapons are live, but I'm not running full auto until I know Revenant isn't going to hijack them herself." Isard gritted his teeth. "Then fire manually." The first railgun shot ripped through the void. Unlike Dominion weapons, energy-based, elegant, controlled, Revenant spoke in solid destruction. A hyper-accelerated slug tore through the Dominion vessel's bow, shredding through its shielding like paper. The impact sent the enemy ship into a violent spiral. "They weren't expecting that," Duval muttered. Isard didn't give them a second to recover. "Follow it up!" Tannhorst was already ahead of him. The second shot took the Dominion vessel straight through the midsection. The ship convulsed, a silent scream in the black before detonating in a bloom of fire and wreckage. Silence filled the command deck. Then, "They let us find it," Voss murmured, his voice barely audible. But they never wanted us to use it. Isard exhaled sharply, his heartbeat a steady war drum in his ears. Then we find out why. Tannhorst scowled, wiping his hands on his uniform. And if they come knocking again? Isard's gaze flicked to the heads-up display, where Revenant status updates continued to roll in, systems aligning, weapons recalibrating, more pieces of its true nature sliding into place. Then we make sure they never leave the fight alive. The Dominion ship disintegrated in the void, torn apart by the Revenant's railguns. Debris scattered, chunks of alloy and fragmented bulkheads spinning weightlessly in the dark. But Isard didn't exhale, didn't relax, because this had been a test. The real fight hadn't started yet. "Status report," he ordered, voice steady. Duval swept his hands across the heads-up display. No structural damage, weapons recalibrating, shields stabilizing. A pause. Then, in a voice quieter than before, "We're alone. For now." "For now," Isard echoed. Tannhorst rubbed his jaw, eyes locked on the debris field. They sent a single ship. Suicide mission. They knew they weren't getting out alive. Voss, who had been silent until now, leaned against his station. Because they weren't trying to win. They were testing our response time, seeing what we'd do. And now they know. His fingers tapped against the screen, pulling up encrypted data logs. They know Revenant is active, and they'll come in force next time. Isard nodded once. Good, let them. But war wasn't fought on brute strength alone. This next fight wouldn't be about who had the bigger guns. It would be about who controlled the battlefield before the first shot was fired. "We're not waiting for them to dictate the terms," Isard said. "We take the initiative." Tannhorst folded his arms. "You have a plan, I assume?" "We don't fight on their terms," Isard replied. He gestured toward the laser plasma display where data from the wreckage scrolled across the screen. "They'll come expecting Revenant to stand her ground. They'll send multiple ships, box us in, force us into a defensive position." He turned to Duval. "What's the nearest asteroid belt?" Duval's brow furrowed, but his fingers flew across the controls. "The Barren Rift. Dense field. Mostly inactive rock, but there's some old mining infrastructure still in place. Then that's where we set our trap." Tannhorst arched a brow. "You want us to take cover in a rock field?" "Not just take cover," Isard corrected. "We use the terrain to disrupt their formations. The Dominion fights clean, ordered. Open space battles where they control the range. We don't give them that. We force them into close-quarters combat, cut their lines of sight, make them hesitate." He turned back to Voss. "And you?" Voss blinked. "What about me?" "You're going to make sure their systems are blind before they even reach us." A slow smile crept onto Voss's face. "Jamming arrays?" "Better," Isard said. "A dead signal. We don't just jam them. We let them think Revenant is crippled. We give them nothing. No power readings. No movement. A dead ship floating in a graveyard." Tannhorst's grin sharpened. "And when they move in for the kill?" Isard turned to the screen where the Revenant's newly restored weapon systems gleamed in diagnostic projections. "We remind them why this ship was buried in the first place." The Barren Rift loomed ahead, a twisting labyrinth of broken rock and derelict mining stations. The ship slipped into the belt's shadows, engines running at minimum output. The Dominion would be watching for power signatures, but Revenant had been built for more than brute force. "We cut everything but life support," Isard ordered. "No active comms, no scans. We disappear." Tannhorst was already working, his crew stripping unnecessary emissions down to the barest whisper. Within minutes, Revenant became a ghost, her systems humming just beneath Dominion detection thresholds. Then, the waiting began. Duval kept his eyes locked on the external feeds, his breath slow and controlled. "They'll be here soon," Voss flexed his fingers. "Their overconfidence is going to get them killed." Tannhorst grunted. "Let's just hope they bring enough bodies to make it worth our time." Silence settled. Not uneasy, not fearful, just waiting. And then, "They're here." Duval's voice barely rose above a whisper. The display flickered, showing the incoming Dominion fleet. Not one ship, not five. 20. A solid formation, advancing with cold, mathematical perfection. They brought an entire battle group, Voss murmured. Of course they did, Isard said. His fingers curled around the edge of the display. They don't just want to kill us. They want to erase us. The Dominion ships moved into a slow encirclement, carefully maneuvering through the asteroid belt, threading the gaps between massive stone hulks. Tannhorst exhaled through his nose. They're treating this like a siege. Which means they still think we're broken, Isard said. Voss was watching the Dominion fleet carefully. They'll deploy recon drones before committing. Then we let them, Isard replied. The first wave of drones dispersed from the leading ships, sweeping the asteroid field in calculated arcs. And that was when Voss acted. His fingers moved in a blur, inputting a silent command. From the wreckage of an old mining station, Revenant's hidden modifications activated. A single pulse radiated outward, targeted, controlled. Not a jamming signal. Something worse. A false return. The drone's systems buckled, their feeds redirected to false data loops. From the Dominion's perspective, the asteroid field became empty. A desolate, abandoned graveyard. No ship, no power signatures. A dead battlefield. And then, just as the first Dominion ships breached firing range, Isard spoke 2 words. Light them up. Tannhorst grinned, and the Revenant came alive. The first volley wasn't aimed at the ships directly. It was aimed at the asteroid field itself. Kinetic rounds shattered the smaller rocks, sending jagged debris careening into Dominion flight paths. Ships swerved, their clean formations ruptured as massive hunks of stone crashed into their shields. The second volley wasn't debris. It was war. Railgun slugs tore through the gaps, striking exposed weak points on their hulls. The Dominion panicked, their ordered approach shattered in a matter of seconds. They're trying to reposition, Duval called. Don't let them, Isard barked. Cut them off. Revenant weaved through the chaos, a predator among blind prey. The Dominion had come expecting a broken relic. They had stepped into a massacre. Tannhorst slammed his fist on the console. Let's see how they like a real fight. By the time the last Dominion ship tried to retreat, it was already too late. Wreckage drifted in the silence, the once perfect fleet in ruins. Isard exhaled, his grip on the console relaxing. Voss, he said, send them a message. Voss tilted his head. What kind? Isard's gaze never left the battlefield. The kind that makes them afraid. Voss smirked. With pleasure. The message was sent. A simple transmission, broadcast across the remaining Dominion channels. Revenant is awake. We are not your prey, and we are not done. The Dominion fleet was gone. What remained drifted in the black, a graveyard of shattered hulls, broken warships spinning in slow, lifeless spirals. Fires flickered in open breaches, where Dominion bulkheads had split apart like cracked bone, and severed conduits sparked against the cold nothing, their energy bleeding uselessly into the void. And in the center of it all, untouched, waiting, was Revenant. The heads-up displays aboard the command deck flickered with the aftermath. Kill confirmations, systems diagnostics, wreckage telemetry. But Isard barely looked at them. His eyes were locked on the void beyond the viewport, on the Dominion ships that hadn't been fast enough to escape. We left some alive, Duval said, voice even. 3 ships limping away. They'll make it back to Dominion space. Good, Isard replied. Tannhorst turned his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Good? We let them run, Isard said, fingers drumming against the console. We let them crawl home, and we let them tell their people what happened here. Voss folded his arms, staring at the wreckage with narrowed eyes. They'll come back in force. Of course they will. Isard's voice was steel. No hesitation, no fear. They thought we were a mistake. A collection of scavengers playing war with whatever scraps we could find. His gaze swept across the deck, locking onto each of them in turn. That's why they gave us this ship. They thought we'd collapse under the weight of their leftovers, that we'd break ourselves trying to piece it back together, that we'd kneel, grateful for their charity. Silence stretched between them, the only sound the quiet beeping of sensor scans confirming their victory. But they forgot something. Isard turned back to the viewport, the wreckage of a Dominion battle group strewn before him. They forgot that when you hand humanity a weapon, we don't just repair it. We don't just improve it. His fingers curled against the armrest. We make it ours. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Tannhorst let out a low exhale, shaking his head. You realize what this means, right? They'll send everything they have next time, Voss said. Isard nodded. And we'll be ready. The command deck was quiet. Not the silence of fear, the silence of understanding, of certainty. Status of our systems? Isard finally asked. Duval ran his fingers over the heads-up display, scanning the latest readings. Weapons operational. Shielding stable. Railguns at full capacity. The upgrades held. Isard nodded. Then it's time to stop running repairs and start building Revenant for what comes next. Tannhorst leaned back, stretching his arms. You thinking refits? Isard's gaze sharpened. I'm thinking we strip this ship down to the bones. Anything Dominion made that doesn't serve us, we rip it out. Anything we can rebuild stronger, we do. We turn Revenant into something they don't have a countermeasure for. Voss smirked, shaking his head. You want to turn a war relic into a war doctrine. Isard didn't blink. I want to turn it into a message. Duval exhaled, a half laugh under his breath. You really think we can take on the full weight of the Dominion? Isard looked back out at the wreckage. They gave us scrap, he said, voice calm, and we made it the most dangerous ship in the galaxy. His fingers pressed against the command console, activating ship-wide communications. All hands, he said, his voice carrying through the decks. Effective immediately. Revenant is no longer a salvaged Dominion warship. She is no longer a wreck, no longer a remnant of an empire that thought they could bury her. He let the words sink in, let the weight of them press into every officer, every engineer, every gunner on board. We are no one's charity project, no one's vassal state, no one's scavengers. He glanced once more at the shattered Dominion fleet, their arrogance reduced to drifting carcasses. We are the storm they never saw coming. Tannhorst grinned, standing from his console. Now that, he muttered, I can get behind. Duval chuckled, rolling his shoulders. Damn right. Voss gave a slow nod. Let's give them something to fear. The command deck shifted into motion. Displays flickered, engineering logs pulled up, tactical discussions forming as the crew moved with newfound purpose. They had been given scraps. Now they would turn them into legend. Isard leaned forward, his voice low, just for his officers. And when the Dominion comes back, he said, we don't fight for survival. His gaze locked onto the primary display where Revenant loomed in the black, whole and unbroken. We fight to end them.